Justice to these girls, all those poor girls that have been raped and abused.
Tommy Robinson, is he a man raising concerns that others ignored, or a far-right figure exploiting the victims of sexual abuse for his own ends?
They feel they're not being listened to, they're being ignored, and that the system is corrupt, and they're looking, to go on movements like this because they feel that's the only way that their voices can get heard.
Well, Newsnight tries to understand the roots of Tommy Robinson's appeal and where his movement is headed. Good evening. When Tommy Robinson, real name Stephen Yaxley Lennon, the former leader of the far-right group the EDL, was jailed in May for contempt of court, a petition for his release attracted more than 500,000 signatures. No longer involved with the English Defence League, he has gathered support after campaigning against what he calls Muslim grooming gangs, following now concluded court cases around England. He's also campaigned in Italy, Germany and other European countries where anti-Islam parties have made electoral gains. This phenomenon has not been seen here in the UK, but Tommy Robinson appears to be gaining some apparently more mainstream political backing. The leader of UKIP has said he would like him to join his party. Is Robinson tapping into anti-Muslim sentiment or simply fomenting it? And what are the roots of his support? This report by Gabriel Gatehouse contains strong language and comments some might find offensive.
Tommy Robinson, a villain to many, but a hero to some.
What a wonderful man, bringing the justice to these girls, all those poor girls that have been raped and abused.
Stephen Yaxley Lennon, that's his real name, appeared at the Old Bailey at the end of September. He was sent to jail earlier this year. More than 500,000 people signed a petition calling for his release. His sentence was later quashed, but he still could go back to prison. Tommy Robinson was once leader of the English Defence League, or EDL. These days, he calls himself a journalist, focusing on paedophile grooming gangs, an issue which has gained widespread notoriety after trials of child sexual abuse concluded in Rotherham, Rochdale, Oxford and elsewhere, including a case last year in Canterbury.
The public realise that the full weight of the establishment is coming down on my shoulders because I speak openly and honestly and tell the facts about Islam. We have Islamic rape gangs terrorising this entire country.
He and his supporters believe they're fighting a battle, not just against child abuse, but against a whole religion, Islam, and against an establishment, the police, the courts, the media, which they believe defends rapists while labelling them as racists.
They're calling Tommy Robinson a Nazi because he's putting the light on a load of Muslim fucking nonsense.
Across Europe, political movements with an overtly Islamophobic agenda have entered the mainstream. So far, this has not happened in Britain. But could this movement morph into a political force? It's a question that's not easy to answer, not least because his supporters mostly hate the media. But that too is part of the story. Tommy Robinson is no longer involved in the EDL. His new movement has its origins in the grooming scandals.
I came from just a normal family background, really. I was a confident girl at school. I was good at school, bubbly, had lots of friends, and there was nothing that vulnerable about me apart from the fact that I was, just a child.
Sammy Woodhouse was 14 when she was first raped.
From that moment on, I was abused mentally, sexually and physically for several years. But he was 24, he was known to all services for being a really dangerous person. He weren't just involved in exploiting children, he was involved in just about every crime you can imagine.
Sammy was just one of an estimated 1,400 children who were raped and abused in Rotherham alone, according to a report into child sexual exploitation there between 1997 and 2013. The gang that abused her is now in jail. The report found that most of the victims were young white girls, while most of the perpetrators were of Pakistani heritage. The local authorities completely failed to tackle the problem.
And unfortunately, you know, the very people that was meant to be protecting me, such as social workers and police officers, they didn't, and some of them, you know, they was actually helping him.
Why do you think the people who were supposed to protect you did nothing?
I think there was some professionals trying to raise the alarm, but they was called racist. You know, a lot of people doing this was Pakistani Muslims, and people were scared of that. And I think, you know, a lot of professionals just saw us as little slags, you know, little lovesick teenagers that kept going back, and that we was the ones to blame.
Previous warnings about the extent of the abuse were either suppressed or ignored. This story, which happened in other towns and cities as well, is one of the driving forces behind the Tommy Robinson movement. New allegations continue to come to light. Sammy does not support Robinson, but she can understand why others do.
A lot of the people going on these marches, you know, I know some that are victims, that are families, just normal kind of working day people that are just so angry at what's happened. They feel they're not being listened to, they're being ignored, and that the system is corrupt, and they're looking, you know, to go on movements like this because they feel that's the only way that their voices can get heard.
Many of the survivors of abuse are still not ready to tell their story publicly. We spoke to two other women. Their views on Tommy Robinson vary. One said she thought he was highlighting an important issue. Another, who was raped by a number of different men, disagreed. She said, "I don't see him marching against my white abusers." Sammy Woodhouse says Tommy Robinson is selective in which cases he chooses to focus on.
You know, if they're going to talk about child rape, about this system and the failures, then they should be talking about it as a whole and not just by Pakistani Muslims. There's, you know, majority of paedophiles are actually white males.
The majority of paedophiles in this country are white men. But go to any Tommy Robinson rally and you'll come away with the impression that child abuse is somehow linked to Islam. And that narrative is now being perpetuated by a national political party.
The rape gang members are predominantly followers of the cult of Muhammad. They justify their crimes to themselves because of the ideology that they follow. Non-cult followers are lesser human beings. Women are the possessions of men. The founder of their cult was himself a paedophile and kept sex slaves.
This is the leader of a party that came third in terms of actual votes cast in the general election in 2015. At the last election, they fared much worse. Is UKIP looking to replicate the successes of overtly Islamophobic European parties, such as that of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands? We wanted to ask Gerard Batten, but he declined to be interviewed for this film. What is clear is that many of Tommy Robinson's supporters feel that we in the media have only one aim: to label them as racists.
Yeah, we're not far up, we're not racist, we're not Nazis. We've got black people here.
Throw people off buildings, we don't do nothing.
Yeah.
Mixed race, been friends for 40 years.
Yeah, and I'm a racist.
How's he racist?
And I'm a racist. How's that a racist?
The BBC are here.
The anger against the media makes it difficult to explore the nuance, the spectrum of opinion within the Tommy Robinson movement. So we went to meet a man who was once close to him.
Labels are dangerous. a lot of things we were saying in the EDL we were deemed as racist. To us personally, we weren't. We were probably anti-Muslim, anti-Islam, definitely, but we weren't being listened to. And I think that's like the rise of the people now on the streets, is because people still aren't being listened to. People are still being labelled.
Ivan has turned his back on Tommy Robinson, but he does say that the media has played a role in shaping the way Islam is perceived among his supporters.
It was Ajahn Chowdhury, really. I think that's what started me on my journey, I guess, on the talk shows, chat shows, in the newspapers. He seemed to be the go-to Muslim.
Anjem Chowdhury, welcome to Hard Talk.
Well, I'm joined now by the radical cleric Anjem Chowdhury.
Well, joining us now is Anjem Chowdhury from Allah Ghuraba, an organisation.
The stuff he was saying, I kind of bought into that form of that interpretation of Islam. You forget, after Lee Rigby was killed in 2013, he was on the telly the next day, Ajahn Chowdhury.
I find it quite extraordinary that you could not say that you abhorred the scene of him standing, what he had done. He had actually killed a man in the street, and you can't bring yourself to say...
One man killed in the street does not equate to the hundreds of thousands of millions, in fact, who have been slaughtered by the British and American and the foreign policy.
Documentaries as well play a big part, because back in 2008, 2009, there was a documentary called Undercover Mosque.
Tonight on Dispatches, an ideology of bigotry and intolerance spreading through Britain, with its roots in Saudi Arabia.
We Muslims have been ordered to do brainwashing
on women's rights.
Allah created the woman with vision.
If she doesn't wear hijab, we hit her.
That programme showed everything back then that we were already thinking. So when we talk about it, we're bad, but when it's on the TV, it's sort of acceptable.
And this is a closed group.
In an age of Facebook and YouTube, the established media has less control over who does and who does not get a voice. Will Balde, a coordinator for the government's anti-radicalisation strategy, Prevent, took us through some of the closed discussion groups online. You find a broad spectrum of opinion.
You know, a lot of them are just people that haven't had a voice before, so it's a broad church, but within that you've also got pockets of traditional far-right extremism. The traditional notion of far-right, I think, is evolving. It's always been people that have taken patriotism towards nationalism, have taken concerns around cultural identity into an actual threat to our cultural identity because of immigration. But what we're seeing now is a more explicitly anti-Muslim movement, and certainly when you look at the social media posts, when you look at the language at the rallies, they're hanging their politics, their ideology explicitly on an anti-Muslim agenda.
Should we be worried?
I might be the wrong person to ask. I have quite a pessimistic view of the immediate future. I feel as if common sense is being drowned out and the platforms are being given over to the extremist ideologues.
And that's from somebody who works in Prevent?
Yeah.
Gerard Batten has said he'd like Tommy Robinson to join UKIP. Under current party rules, he's banned because of his previous association with the EDL. Some say such a move would condemn the party to the margin. But others look at European parties that have adopted explicitly Islamophobic agendas and see electoral success. Meanwhile, Sammy Woodhouse sees people playing politics with her story.
A lot of people jumped on the bandwagon and just tried to use it for their own gain. And as well, you know, there's a lot of people taking credit for things that they haven't done. Now, you know, if we're going to be really honest, the people that have exposed scandals throughout the country is survivors contacting the media. And when you get people such as, you know, Britain's First or Tommy Robinson and other people saying, well, actually, we exposed Rotherham and we exposed other places. Well, no, you didn't. And I do think that they have highlighted the issue. They've, you know, raised awareness on it, but they didn't expose it, and it is disrespectful to take credit for what we've done.
Sammy Woodhouse ending that report by Gabriel Gatehouse. I'm joined now by Nesreen Malik, a columnist at The Guardian, and Danny Lockwood, publisher of The Press, a local newspaper published in Batley in West Yorkshire. Thank you both very much for coming in. Let's just pick up on that Sammy Woodhouse point first. She was suggesting that Stephen Yaxley Lennon, which of course is his real name, takes credit for his role in this, whereas she says it's victims coming forward that made sure that this story was out.
I think that rather sort of deflects from the main point, actually, because such as I understand what Robinson is about, the Robinson persona, it's about a far broader church, if I can use that word, than just the rape gangs, Kirsty. And so I think he's kind of a scattergun approach to everything, and he gets painted anti-Islamic on all kinds of levels. I do think that isn't quite the point of what he's about and what this phenomenon that we're witnessing right now is about.
Well, what do you think it's about?
I think it's about the point that was really well touched on in that report, that people have not had a voice. I don't think that he speaks specifically to the far right because they talk to themselves anyway. I think he is tapping into a Middle England that sees that they don't get their views expressed, reflected, or given any credence at all.
You were saying that you know, it's not as narrow as what he calls these particular gangs, but actually that at the moment is what the focus is. And do you think Sammy Woodhouse is right? She is right, isn't he? That they came forward themselves. They put themselves out there,
well, and
in the sense that he is building on that.
Absolutely. I mean, Tommy Robinson is an opportunist. He did not have a lot of interest in the grooming gang story before it became completely mainstream, and then he threw himself behind it. A couple of years ago, this man was completely washed up. He had a sort of makeshift crew of cameras and microphones, and he was basically ambulance chasing terrorist attacks. An Uber driver climbed the pavement to the Natural History Museum, and Stephen Yaxley was there saying this was terrorism. So the fact that he's sort of built this broad church against Islam and Muslims and grooming, and he has these millions of people behind him, completely belies the fact that he was nowhere before this story happened.
Isn't Tommy Robinson the symptom, not the cause of this? Because what we're looking at now,
he might be the he's made himself the focus of it.
And I think I was really encouraged to see that film. I thought it was really intelligent, articulate piece of documentary making, and how refreshing. Because I think that the BBC is playing catch up on this, as you kind of acknowledged in that, Kirsty, as is the mainstream media. Well, he can now talk to millions of people without the filter.
Well, I wonder about that, because it is true, of course, that mainstream media has to go through a lot more hoops when we even discuss stories like this. But actually, what happens is that when you have got Facebook, you have got mainstream media, he does get to far more people. But I mean, even the fact he was going to be discussed tonight, we had somebody on social media saying it was appalling. It was even being discussed.
Yeah, but also but the premise in the first place that he's not getting play on mainstream media is completely false. You yourself have interviewed him, Kirsty, not too long ago. There was a documentary on Newsnight as well, I think, in July, about his supporters. He has been interviewed, supporters of his have been interviewed on Radio 4. He's been on the BBC's programmes late at night after Question Time. Tommy Robinson is being interviewed by the mainstream media. He was on Sky News last week. Yeah. So,
do you think it's right that he is interviewed, Danny?
No, I think the point isn't about him, actually. The point is that the problems that we have in communities up and down the country. He's a product of Luton. The EDL became what it did because of people like Anjem Choudhury. So the fact that he is giving voice to people who feel that they've been disenfranchised and don't have one, I think that is the point.
That is interesting, but the whole question of Anjem Choudhury is interesting, because you heard the former EDL member saying there was in a way that they were radicalised by seeing Anjem Choudhury. So it's interesting. It's not that people might criticise Anjem Choudhury being on for radicalising Muslims. They actually radicalise the anti-Muslim sentiment, which I think is... and so what do you do about Anjem Choudary? Do you simply say, we must not have people with those sentiments airing their views?
You've got to have police, and you've got to have local authorities, and you've got to have government, and you've got to have instruments of state that are willing to tackle the problems that Robinson says he sees and that people believe he sees because they see it in their own towns.
But I think that there is a disconnect between what Tommy Robinson is saying and what people are concerned about. I think the way Tommy Robinson expresses them sharpens them and actually removes them from where they're situated. We're running the risk of creating the same issue we created with Anjem Choudary, which is to articulate issues via the most extreme opportunists, and that is why people aren't being listened to.
But you heard there in that film, the leader of UKIP welcomes and wants Tommy Robinson to come and join him because he sees in Tommy Robinson a way, I suppose, of promulgating what was essentially anti-Islamic stuff that he was spouting on that stage. He thinks that that is the way to get to a larger audience.
Absolutely.
But my point is, do you simply stop Tommy Robinson? You can't stop free speech.
No, but this is not about free speech. Tommy Robinson has free speech. He has it at the BBC, he has it on Sky News, he has it on the radio, he has it in the press. Tommy Robinson has free speech. This is not about free speech. It is about the disconnect between these valid concerns that people have about immigration and about culture and about grooming gangs and the way that Tommy Robinson is utilised them basically to further his career. It's a living for him.
I'm not sure. Well, I'm not sure that is quite the case. I think it's something that he believes in very firmly, and I think, and you don't think so. I've seen his social media posts with millions of viewers, and some of it is quite articulate stuff. Surprised me. I've been interviewed by him, and I found an inquiring young man who perhaps doesn't say a lot of things that I agree with at all, but the fact is that he does key in this modern social media age to millions of people.
Do you think mainstream media is losing ground then?
But that's a different question.
But it is a different question, but it's the kind of question that we kind of have to answer.
It's not losing ground, but it's still trying to find its way in a world where there are many other platforms that people are using. How do you gauge, how do you size a story? You can't size it by links and views.
So what do you do?
Have to size it by how relevant it is on the ground.
Do you know platform, Tommy Robinson, do you know platform Anjem Choudary? What do you do?
The minute that you know platform them, you give them a bigger voice and a presence and a persona and a cause.
You don't blanket no platform, you try and size the issue and you try and see, is this a relevant, appropriate speaker for this issue, or are we playing into their hands by interviewing the most extreme and the most opportunist?
But if the most extreme is garnering 500,000 signatures in a petition, surely it's better to have people on and have a rigorous interview than not have them on.
But what does that achieve?
Well, you could start tackling the problems, which he's articulating.
So this is where we agree. This is where we agree.
Absolutely.
There are ways to interrogate the issues that allegedly Tommy Robinson is raising without doing it via Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson makes himself the story and actually distracts from the issues that you legitimately think he's expressing.
The thing is this: if we weren't discussing Tommy Robinson right now, we would be discussing someone else who would fill that place and that chasm.
No, we would be discussing the issues and not Tommy Robinson. That is the problem.
Thank you both very much indeed.